What group of Christians produced the Gospel of John? That is a question addressed by the historical critical field of gospel community studies. In their quest to reconstruct the world behind the biblical texts, critical historians have tried to understand the different Christian communities that produced the canonical Gospels. They have been especially interested in John's Gospel because of how different it is from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In this post of Theology and Religion with J.D. Reiner, we will survey the fascinating topic of the Johannine community. We will see how experts detect evidence of the community in the Gospel, what reconstruction scholars have proposed, and what critics of the theories have said. How do we determine the presence of the community behind John's Gospel? To do so, it is necessary that we read the Gospels as primarily reflecting issues within their own communities, primarily, that is, and only secondarily reflecting issues in the life of the historical Jesus. Within Johannine studies, an expert named J. Louis Martyn wrote a book called History and Theology in the Fourth Gospel in 1968. In that book, he advocated a two-level reading of the Gospel, which means that the events talk both about the historical Jesus and about the Johannine community's history. The main example of the two-level drama that Martyn provides is the story of Jesus' healing of the man born blind, which is a very famous story. I'm sure that you've heard of it. This story is found in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. I'm going to quote it here, and some of the passages condensed for brevity using ellipses, so you can just follow along on my PowerPoint or just listen if you're listening through the podcast. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. He spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way therefore, and washed, and came seeing. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, Is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already, that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Then said they to him again, What did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and ye did not hear. Wherefore would ye hear it again? Will ye also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. The man answered and said unto them, Why herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, it was not heard that any man opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered and said unto him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. At first glance, this just seems to be a healing story, just like any of the other healing stories in the Synoptic Gospels or elsewhere in John. Jesus sees a man blind from his birth, he heals him, and the man puts faith in Jesus, for which the Jewish leaders throw him out of the synagogue as punishment. Yet thanks to the two-level method, Martyn believes that there is more going on here. In his opinion, the author of John is using a traditional story about Jesus to say something about the past struggles of the Johannine community. specifically the period in which the Jewish Johannine Christians became separated from mainstream Jewish religion and the synagogues. The blind man in this episode represents the Johannine churches who were thrown out of the synagogues a few decades after Jesus' ministry. Martyn's thesis had a huge effect on the field of Johannine studies, as we shall see. So, if it is possible to detect the Johannine community's history in the Gospel, then what did that history look like? Many scholars have attempted to reconstruct what the community was like, but we will focus on one of the foremost experts, Raymond E. Brown. Brown has offered one of the most comprehensive histories of the community available, and so we will survey his views here. In 1979, Brown published a book called The Community of the Beloved Disciple. In this book, he presented the following model of the community's history. The community began with its founder, the Beloved Disciple. This was a former disciple of John the Baptist who was an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry. While many think that the Beloved Disciple was John the son of Zebedee, Brown believes that he was actually a Judean disciple whose name is now lost to us. He started a community of Jewish Christians in Palestine after Jesus' death. Eventually, the community came to include Samaritans and Gentiles. In the couple of decades after 70 CE, the Jews expelled the Jewish Christians from the synagogues, resulting in conflicts between the Christians who wanted to stay within the synagogue communities and those who did not want to compromise their worship of Jesus. A leader in the community then produced the Gospel, which was probably edited at least once by himself and then later by a redactor. Around the time that the Johannine epistles were being written, the community was being divided into two main groups, a group that was becoming Gnostic in its theology, and a group that continued to believe in Jesus' humanity as well as his divinity. When the church split, the mainstream group was absorbed by the apostolic churches, while the Gnostic group went its own way. That is Raymond Brown's view. Of course, one can see that some parts of his hypothesis are a little speculative, but we must give Brown credit for using excellent historical critical methods to try to determine what different parts of the Gospel and Epistles of John were responding to in their own settings. Brown is modest about his conclusions as well. He writes that he will be happy if 60% of his hypothesis turns out to be right. Even though most experts agree that there was a distinct Johannine community, there has been a significant scholarly movement arguing against the existence of this community. If we ignored talking about these recent experts, then we would not be surveying the field in a representative way in this post. One of the main people espousing this alternative view is Richard Bauckham. In 1998, he and several of his colleagues published a book called The Gospels for All Christians. Bauckham's school of thought mainly argues that all four canonical Gospels, including the Gospel of John, were intended to be read widely in the Christian church and not just among individual communities or churches. Regarding the Gospel of John in particular, Bauckham's student Edward Klink has argued against the Johannine community's existence in his 2010 book, The Sheep of the Fold. Klink believes that the internal evidence within John's Gospel and the external evidence surrounding the text do not provide any real basis for reconstructing anything like a community behind the Gospel. Most of the experts promoting the alternative view have conservative or evangelical leanings, but those of us who are more mainstream or liberal scholars should remember that their theological opinions should not lead us to dismiss their contributions too easily. Currently, historical critics still interpret the Gospel as a product of an individual community of Christians, and even though those models change over time, the basic idea seems here to stay. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this post from Theology and Religion with J.D. Reiner. If you are viewing this on YouTube, please click on the like, subscribe, and notification buttons to receive more content. You may send an email to jonathandreiner@gmail.com if you would like to get in touch with me. Be sure to visit my website at jdreiner.com to view all my work in one place. If you wish to support the work, then you can donate using the links in the description or at my site. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.